I remember the acrid smell of smoke before I even saw the flames licking at my favorite coat. My husband, Daniel, held my passport in one hand and a lighter in the other, his eyes empty and cold. The living room of our Boston apartment felt suddenly alien, as if the furniture we'd chosen together had transformed into unfamiliar shapes in the dim evening light. "What are you doing?" My voice came out as a whisper, though I'd meant to shout. Daniel clicked the flame up and pressed it against the leather-bound booklet, watching it curl and blacken as ash drifted onto our cream-colored carpet. The same carpet we'd argued about at Macy's 3 years ago, before compromising on something we both could live with. Now, it collected the ashes of my identity. My breath caught in my throat. This was not the man I married. The Daniel I knew laughed too loudly at comedy shows and cried during dog food commercials. This stranger before me had jaw muscles clenched tight enough to crack walnuts and eyes that refused to meet mine. "You don't deserve to leave the country," he said flatly. "Not after what you've done." "What I've done?" The words felt thick in my mouth. "Daniel, I don't understand." A movement behind him caught my eye. My sister Rachel stepped out from the shadows of our hallway, arms folded across her chest, a triumphant smirk etched across her face. Her presence made no sense. She lived in Providence, a 2-hour drive away. She never dropped by. "He knows everything, Emily," Rachel said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "About all your business trips. About the men." "Men? What men?" I looked between them, feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. "There were never any. Now I can marry him," she continued as if I hadn't spoken, her voice slicing through me like a blade. "He should have always been mine. You stole him from me." She took a step closer to Daniel, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. I could taste the bile rising in my mouth. Every word felt like a physical blow, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. The pieces clicked into horrifying place, the late-night texts Daniel had been receiving, his growing coldness over the past months, Rachel's sudden interest in our marriage problems. "You're lying," I said, my voice steadier now. "Daniel, she's lying to you." "I've never cheated. Not once." But his eyes, those hazel eyes that once looked at me with such tenderness, were hardened with conviction. "I saw the emails, Em. The hotel receipts. The pictures." "What pictures?" I demanded, stepping forward. "Show me these supposed pictures." Rachel laughed, the sound like broken glass. "Don't bother with the innocent act. We found everything when we went through your laptop while you were at your mom's last weekend." My mother, suffering from early-onset dementia, whom I'd visited faithfully every Sunday since her diagnosis. Even that sacred ritual had been used against me. Daniel dropped the burning passport to the floor, grinding it under his heel. "I want you gone by morning," he said, his voice oddly hollow. "Take what you can carry. The rest." "I don't care." I stood rooted to the spot, watching the last shred of cloth flutter to the floor. The room seemed to spin around me, the familiar walls of our apartment closing in. 3 years of marriage going up in flames just like my passport. A strange calm descended over me then. I walked past them to our bedroom, no, his bedroom now, and pulled out the emergency suitcase I kept in the back of our closet. With mechanical precision, I packed essentials, clothes, toiletries, the flash drive with my work files, the jewelry my grandmother had left me. I could hear them whispering in the living room, occasional bursts of Rachel's laughter slicing through the apartment. When I returned to the living room, they were sitting together on our sofa, his arm around her shoulders. The casual intimacy of the pose told me everything I needed to know about how long this betrayal had been brewing. I didn't hesitate. I snatched the meager belongings I'd packed, my suitcase slipping from my trembling grip as I reached for the one photograph they hadn't destroyed, me and Daniel on our wedding day, its frame still on the entryway table. My fingers closed around it as Rachel called out, "Running away won't change what you did." I turned at the door, looking at the sister I'd grown up with, the woman who'd been my maid of honor. "I didn't do anything. But you did. And when he figures out what that is, I hope he remembers this moment." With that, I fled into the night, the cool April air hitting my face like a slap. My heart hammered with equal parts fear and resolve as I hauled my suitcase down the brownstone steps and onto Marlborough Street. The familiar neighborhood suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. I would prove my innocence, and I would make my sister pay. The streetlights blurred into streaks of gold as I stumbled toward Arlington Street, where I knew I could flag down a taxi. The weight of my burned passport pressed against my ribs like a leaden stone, even though the physical remains lay abandoned on my former living room floor. I clutched the crumpled photograph of happier days, me smiling beside Daniel on our wedding day, its edges singed but intact. Every step away from that apartment felt like shedding a layer of my former life. A cab finally slowed at my frantic waving. The driver, an older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, took one look at my tear-streaked face and suitcase before asking gently, "Where to, miss?" I hesitated. Where could I go? My friends were mostly couples we knew together. My parents lived in Florida now, Mom in her care facility and Dad in the condo nearby. The only person I could think of was my college roommate Lindsay, but she'd moved to Chicago last year. The Midtown Hotel, I finally said, naming a place I'd passed 100 times but never entered. It wasn't fancy, but it would do for tonight. Tomorrow I could think more clearly. Rough night, the driver asked, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Well, whatever it is, sunrise has a way of making things look different, he offered, pulling into traffic. My name's Joe, by the way. Emily, I replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving my real name. What if Daniel or Rachel somehow tracked me down? The paranoia was already setting in. We drove in silence through the city I'd called home for 5 years, past the Boston Public Garden where Daniel had proposed, past Copley Square where we'd taken photos after getting our marriage license. Each landmark felt like another blow. Here we are, Joe announced, pulling up to the modest hotel. When I tried to pay him, he waved me off. This one's on me. Just promise you'll get some rest, okay? His unexpected kindness nearly broke me again. I thanked him through a tight throat and wheeled my suitcase into the lobby. The night clerk, a young man with a pierced eyebrow and tired eyes, didn't ask questions when I paid in cash for a single room. 20 minutes later, I found myself in a dingy motel room, the stale smell of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls despite the "no smoking" sign prominently displayed. I lay awake on a lumpy mattress, replaying my sister's words over and over, the rage inside me coiling tighter with each breath. How long had they been planning this? Had Daniel ever loved me at all? And what evidence had Rachel manufactured to convince him I'd been unfaithful? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart leapt, thinking perhaps Daniel had realized his mistake. Instead, it was Rachel. Don't try to contact him. It's over. He'll be filing the divorce papers tomorrow. I hurled the phone across the room, where it bounced off the faded wallpaper and landed on the carpet. I had lost everything: my home, my dignity, even my identity. But I still had the truth. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams where I was running through Boston streets while Rachel chased me, holding flaming torches that turned into my burning passport. I woke before dawn, my body aching and my mind racing. The hotel room looked even more depressing in the gray morning light filtering through thin curtains. I retrieved my phone, miraculously unbroken, and blocked Rachel's number before checking my bank accounts. Thank God I'd insisted on keeping my own accounts separate from our joint one. I had enough savings to last a few months if I was careful. I showered under lukewarm water, letting it wash away my tears, but not my resolve. As I toweled off, I caught my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, my usually styled brown hair hanging limp around my face. I hardly recognized myself. That's when it hit me. I needed to become someone Rachel and Daniel wouldn't recognize either. Someone stronger. Someone who wouldn't run away crying. Someone who would fight back. I dressed in yesterday's clothes and ventured out into the morning, finding a diner where I could get coffee and collect my thoughts. The waitress, Dottie according to her name tag, kept refilling my cup without my asking, giving me space to think as I occupied the corner booth. By my third cup, I had a plan. I pulled a notebook from my purse and began making lists. First, I needed a place to stay, something more permanent than this hotel. Next, I needed to figure out exactly what evidence they claimed to have found. And finally, I needed to gather proof of my innocence. I made a phone call to a real estate agent I'd met at a networking event last year, explaining I needed a short-term rental immediately. By noon, I had an appointment to see a studio apartment in Somerville available for a 3-month lease. The apartment was small but clean, with a kitchenette, a Murphy bed, and a view of a brick wall. I signed the lease on the spot, relieved to have a base of operations. As the agent left, I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. Then I got to work. I unpacked my few belongings, setting up my laptop on the small desk by the window. I made a trip to the nearest Target, purchasing essentials, groceries, toiletries, a cheap printer, and a corkboard. By evening, I had transformed the blank wall above the desk into my war room. I scribbled 2 objectives on a scrap of paper, prove I was not a cheater, exact revenge on my sister, and taped it to the center of the board. With no passport to cross borders, I resolved to cross emotional lines instead. The old Emily would have never considered revenge. The old Emily believed in forgiveness and second chances. But the old Emily died the moment her husband burned her passport at her sister's behest. As night fell over Boston once more, I sat cross-legged on my new bed, staring at the corkboard. The magnitude of what I had lost threatened to overwhelm me again, but I refused to let it. Instead, I channeled that pain into determination. I will not break, I whispered to the empty room. I will not disappear. And with that promise to myself, I finally fell into a dreamless sleep. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own life. The studio apartment in Somerville transformed into my personal investigation headquarters, with sticky notes spreading across the corkboard like an invasive species. Each morning, I rose with the sun, fueled by a mixture of black coffee and burning resolve. My first challenge was accessing my old email accounts. Daniel had changed the passwords, but he'd forgotten about my recovery methods. After 3 frustrating days of security questions and verification codes sent to an old backup address, I finally broke through. What I found sent ice through my veins. Someone, Rachel, obviously, had been sending emails from my account. Flirtatious messages to fictional men with generic names like Mike from sales and Jason from the conference. There were hotel confirmations for rooms I'd never booked in cities I'd visited for legitimate business. Worst of all, there were doctored photos, my face carefully photoshopped onto another woman's body in compromising positions. Amateur hour, I muttered, noting the telltale pixelation around my face in the images. But it was enough to fool Daniel, who wanted to believe the worst. I printed everything, creating a timeline of the fake evidence alongside my actual whereabouts. The pattern was clear. Whenever I traveled for my marketing job, Rachel had manufactured a parallel narrative of infidelity. My heart pounded as I pieced together flight itineraries and legitimate hotel receipts that proved I'd spent those years working abroad, not sleeping with strangers. I contacted my company's IT department, claiming I needed backup access to my work calendar for tax purposes. Marcos, the sympathetic tech who'd always had a soft spot for me, granted temporary access without asking questions. "If anyone asks, you never spoke to me," he messaged. I wondered what rumors were already flying around my former workplace. Armed with my work calendar, I could prove exactly where I'd been and when. But that wasn't enough. I needed witnesses, people who could corroborate my presence at conferences, client meetings, and team dinners during those supposedly illicit rendezvous. I started making calls. To my relief, former colleagues were willing to help, especially once I explained the situation in vague terms about needing to clarify some dates for legal reasons. Most remembered me, the marketing manager, who always brought local chocolates back from business trips, who gave detailed presentations, who never stayed for more than one drink at happy hour because I'd promised to call my husband. "Of course I remember you in Chicago that weekend," said Tara from the New York office. "You spent the whole dinner showing US pictures of your husband and that trip to Cape Cod. It was actually kind of annoying how in love you were." Each corroboration felt like a lifeline pulling me back from the brink of self-doubt. Even as I gathered evidence, part of me had wondered, was there something I'd done to deserve this? Had I somehow invited Rachel's jealousy or Daniel's suspicion? Each confirmation from a colleague or business contact helped silence those doubts. The most surprising ally came in the form of Tony Delgado, the concierge from the Marriott where I'd stayed in San Francisco. I'd helped him surprise his girlfriend with concert tickets after he mentioned it was their anniversary, and he remembered me clearly. "Ms. Lawson, I specifically recall you were working in the lobby until nearly midnight on both nights. You asked me for extra coffee packets, remember? I can definitely confirm you were alone." I tracked down witnesses, colleagues who'd met me during business trips, hotel staff who remembered my workaholic habits, even a flight attendant who recalled helping me with my fear of turbulence on a particularly rough flight to Denver. Their corroborations solidified my resolve and stoked the fire of retribution. Meanwhile, I quietly investigated Rachel's digital footprint. She'd always been careless with her passwords, typically variations of her birth year and our childhood dog's name. Within days, I had access to her email, where I found years of obsession hidden in plain sight. Messages to friends about how Daniel should have been hers. Photos of him she'd secretly saved from social media. And finally, the smoking gun, detailed plans spanning months, outlining how she would convince Daniel I was cheating, complete with tutorials on basic image manipulation. "God, Rachel," I whispered to my empty apartment as I read through her methodical plans. "We shared a bunk bed for 12 years. I taught you how to French braid your hair. How could you do this?" But the evidence was undeniable. My sister had orchestrated my downfall with the patience of a spider, weaving a web of lies so intricate that even I had almost believed them. Almost. I printed everything: Rachel's incriminating emails, the doctored photos with their metadata revealing when they'd been created, the testimonies from colleagues and hotel staff. I even reached out to my mother's care facility, confirming my regular Sunday visits that Rachel had claimed were covers for my supposed affairs. The staff was confused but helpful. "You're the only family member who visits regularly," the head nurse told me. "Your sister has been here exactly twice in the past year." That particular betrayal cut deeper than I expected. While I'd been maintaining our family bonds, Rachel had been plotting to steal my husband and destroy my life. By the time I assembled a dossier thick enough to crush a lie, I realized how deeply I'd underestimated my own strength. The girl who fled in tears was gone. In her place stood someone sharpened by betrayal, armed with truth as her weapon. I spent one final day organizing my evidence into a compelling narrative, complete with timestamps, phone records, and witness statements. I created both digital and physical copies, storing them in multiple locations. If Rachel had taught me anything, it was to be thorough. On my final night of preparation, I stood before the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing myself. I'd cut my hair shorter, dyed it from honey blonde to a deep auburn. It wasn't just for disguise, it was a physical manifestation of my transformation. My eyes, once soft with trust, now held a hardened gleam. "You're ready," I told my reflection. I returned to my war room, pinning the last piece of evidence to the board, a photo of Rachel and me as children, arms around each other, gap-toothed smiles beaming at the camera. I traced my finger over our young faces, remembering a time when my biggest complaint about my sister was that she borrowed my clothes without asking. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I rehearsed what would come next: the calculated exposure, the systematic dismantling of Rachel's deception, the reclaiming of my truth. By dawn, I had memorized every detail, anticipated every denial, prepared for every contingency. The girl who had fled in tears from her Boston apartment was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to fight, not just for her reputation, but for justice. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through my window as I packed my evidence into a sleek leather portfolio. "Time to end this," I said to the empty room, my voice steady and sure. The final phase of my plan was about to begin, and neither Rachel nor Daniel would see it coming. I decided my revenge would be surgical, precise. No emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations, not yet. I wanted to be calculated in a way Rachel had never anticipated from her soft-hearted older sister. On a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I'd fled our apartment, I executed the first phase of my plan. Daniel would be at his financial consulting office on State Street, where he prided himself on being the first to arrive each day. Perfect. First, I contacted my husband's workplace, sending a succinct email with my dossier attached, dated travel records, corroborating testimonies, and a timeline exposing my sister's manipulations. I addressed it not just to Daniel, but to his boss, Warren Sheffield, a family man who had once drunkenly confided at the company Christmas party that his first wife had cheated on him with his brother. I've recently discovered evidence of identity theft and fraud that may impact company security, I wrote, keeping my language professional. As your firm handles sensitive financial information, I felt obligated to bring this to your attention immediately. It wasn't just revenge, it was the truth. If Rachel had accessed my accounts to plant evidence, who knew what else she might have compromised? I didn't sign my name as Emily Porter, Daniel's soon-to-be ex-wife. Instead, I used Emily Lawson, my maiden name, reclaiming the identity I'd had before him. At precisely 8:47 a.m., when I knew the morning staff meeting would be ending, I hit send. Then I connected to the traffic camera feed across from Daniel's building, a trick I'd learned from a cybersecurity webinar I'd attended for work last year. I watched through the pixelated feed as Daniel emerged from the conference room, headed toward his office. Within minutes, his posture changed. He sat straighter, then hunched over his desk, then stood abruptly. I imagined his phone buzzing incessantly, unread messages piling up. Warren appeared in the doorway of Daniel's office. Their conversation was obviously heated, Daniel gesturing wildly, Warren's arms crossed firmly over his chest. When Daniel reached for his jacket and briefcase, Warren's hand shot out, stopping him. I didn't need audio to understand. Daniel wasn't going anywhere until this was sorted out. Phase 1, complete. For Phase 2, I needed a broader audience. Over the past week, I'd created an anonymous Instagram account, Truth Teller Boston. The profile picture was a generic stock image of the Boston skyline. The bio simply read, "Sometimes the truth needs a platform." Through this account, I shared carefully selected snippets of my evidence with mutual friends and family. Not the most damning pieces, not yet, but enough to raise questions. A screenshot of Rachel's email planning the deception. A testimonial from my colleague about my whereabouts. The metadata from a doctored photo showing when it had been created. I tagged nobody, named nobody. But I included just enough details that anyone who knew us would recognize the story. Then I sat back and watched as the social media algorithm did its work, bringing my posts to the attention of our shared connections. Melissa Richards, my college friend who had introduced me to Daniel, was the first to message the account. "Emily? Is this you? What's going on?" I didn't respond directly. Instead, I posted another piece of evidence, the nurse's statement confirming my regular visits to my mother while Rachel was noticeably absent. Within hours, the whispers turned to gasps and gasps to outrage. My phone lit up with text messages from friends asking if I was okay, expressing shock at what they were seeing. I saw my sister's carefully constructed facade begin to crumble from afar, her lies unraveling thread by thread in the court of public opinion. Rachel posted a rambling defense on her own social media, claiming she was being framed by someone jealous of her happiness. The desperation was evident in her typo-ridden post. Several mutual friends commented with single question marks or "call me," the social media equivalent of slowly backing away. Daniel's accounts went silent. According to our friend Steve, he had taken a personal day from work, the first in his meticulous career. Phase 2 was unfolding beautifully, but I wasn't finished. For the final act, I needed to be more direct. I wrote a letter, not an email, but an actual handwritten letter on heavy cardstock, to my mother's care facility, explaining everything that had happened and providing documentation of Rachel's deception. I requested that they temporarily restrict Rachel's visiting privileges, citing concern for my mother's emotional well-being. Given my consistent presence and Rachel's documented dishonesty, the facility director agreed. When Rachel inevitably showed up there, her last refuge now that her social circle was disintegrating, she would find herself denied entry to see our mother. Another sanctuary lost. By evening, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I ordered takeout from Faux Pastor on Washington Street and ate it slowly by my window, watching the Somerville traffic below. My phone continued to buzz with notifications, but I ignored them all. The chaos I'd unleashed needed to simmer overnight. In the morning, I sent a simple text to my sister, "Meet me tomorrow at noon. Thinking Cup on Tremont." I have one final truth to share. I hit send without a tremor, certain that by tomorrow she would understand the full weight of her betrayal. The final piece of evidence, my trump card, sat in a sealed envelope on my desk. It was a notarized statement from Kyle Jenkins, Daniel's assistant at the firm, confirming that he had seen Rachel accessing Daniel's computer multiple times when visiting the office, including on dates that corresponded with the fabricated evidence against me. Kyle had been hesitant at first, worried about his job. But when I explained what was at stake and offered to connect him with a friend at a competing firm should he face retaliation, he agreed. His statement was devastating. Not only had Rachel created false evidence, but Daniel had suspected the truth early on and chosen to believe her anyway, likely due to their existing affair. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I took pleasure in their downfall, but because the truth was finally coming to light. Justice, even self-administered justice, has a way of clearing the conscience. In the morning, I dressed carefully in clothes I'd never worn when married to Daniel, a charcoal gray pantsuit with a crimson blouse, my newly auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Professional, powerful, nothing like the soft floral dresses Rachel always teased me about. As I headed toward the Thinking Cup, the spring sunshine felt like a spotlight on a stage I'd carefully set. The final act was about to begin, and I was no longer the victim in this play, but the director. We met in the Thinking Cup on Tremont Street, the same cafe where I'd once celebrated my birthday with both of them. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place of past joy would now host a reckoning. I arrived early, claiming a corner table with a good view of the door. The familiar scent of freshly ground coffee beans and buttery pastries filled the air, but it brought no comfort today. I ordered a black coffee and a croissant I had no intention of eating. The waitress, a college-aged girl with a septum piercing and kind eyes, must have sensed the tension in my posture. "Good luck with whatever you're about to do," she said quietly as she set down my order. "You look like you're going into battle." I smiled tightly. "Something like that." At 3 minutes to noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, running 5 minutes late. "Order me my usual." The audacity almost made me laugh. Her usual, a complicated concoction of half-sweet vanilla latte with almond milk and an extra shot, seemed suddenly emblematic of everything wrong with her. Always special requirements, always exceptions to the rules. I didn't respond. I didn't order her drink. At 12:07, the bell above the door chimed and Rachel entered. She looked terrible, designer clothes still immaculate, but her face drawn, dark circles under her eyes poorly concealed with makeup. Her gaze darted around the cafe until she spotted me, and for a moment, uncertainty flashed across her features. Good. Let her be unsure for once. She slid into the chair across from me, attempting a smile that came across as more of a grimace. She said, using my childhood nickname as if the past month hadn't happened. "This has gotten out of hand. We need to talk." "We're beyond talking," I replied, my voice steady. "But you're right about one thing, this ends today." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What's with the hair? Trying to reinvent yourself?" Classic Rachel, deflect, attack, change the subject. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I pulled out the printed dossier I'd compiled and slid it across the table. The manila folder was 3 inches thick, labeled simply "Truth" in bold black marker. "Before you say another word, read this." Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. I watched her face drain of color as she flipped through page after page of evidence. The blood appeared to quite literally leave her face, rushing down to God knows where, leaving behind a waxy complexion that made her look like a poorly made department store mannequin. "This is..." she began, then stopped. "You can't prove..." Page 37, I interrupted. "The metadata from the photos showing when they were created, after my business trips, not during." Page 43, statements from hotel staff confirming I was alone. Page 68, your own emails planning everything. She stammered apologies that tasted hollow, her bravado stripped away. I let her flail for words, watching her performance with a detachment that surprised even me. There was a time when seeing my little sister in distress would have broken my heart. Now, it felt like watching a stranger in a play. Why? I finally asked when her excuses petered out. What did I ever do to deserve this? Rachel looked down at her hands. You've always had everything so easy, she whispered. Perfect grades, perfect job, perfect husband. Do you know what it's like living in your shadow? Mom and Dad comparing me to you my whole life. So you decided to destroy my marriage? I kept my voice low, conscious of the other patrons, though a few nearby tables had fallen suspiciously quiet. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said. I've always liked Daniel. Since you first introduced us. And when you started traveling so much for work, we got closer. He confided in me about feeling neglected. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Neglected? I was working 60-hour weeks to save for the house he wanted in Brookline. For the family we planned to start this year. She had no response to that. But here's what I really don't understand, I continued, leaning forward. You're my sister. We shared everything growing up. I helped you with college applications. I let you crash on my couch for 6 months when you broke up with Matt. How could you do this to me? A tear slid down her cheek. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That's when I revealed the final blow, a notarized affidavit from Kyle Jenkins, Daniel's assistant, confirming he'd known of my innocence all along and had been complicit in Rachel's scheme. Kyle had documented dates when Rachel had accessed Daniel's computer, along with overheard conversations suggesting their relationship had begun months before the accusations against me. When she looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, I realized revenge was no longer sweet. It was simply necessary closure. The rage that had fueled me these past weeks had burned down to embers. In its place was something colder, clearer. Emily, please, Rachel sobbed quietly. I'll fix this. I'll tell Daniel the truth. We can go back. There is no going back, I cut her off. Not for us as sisters. Not for me and Daniel. Some betrayals can't be undone. What are you going to do? Fear edged into her voice. I've already done it, I replied calmly. Everyone knows the truth now. Daniel's firm is investigating whether company information was compromised. Mom's care facility has restricted your visiting privileges. And as for our friends, I gestured vaguely toward the window, where Boston carried on, unaware of our private drama. They've seen enough to make their own judgments. Rachel's shoulders slumped in defeat. So you've ruined my life to get even. Is that it? I stood, leaving my untouched croissant and half-empty coffee on the table. No, Rachel. I've simply told the truth. You ruined your own life when you decided lies were more important than family. I gathered my purse and jacket, ready to leave this chapter behind me. Rachel grabbed my wrist as I turned to go. What about Mom? She needs both of us. She needs people she can trust, I replied, gently removing her hand. If you want to rebuild that trust, you'll have to do it without using me as a stepping stone. As I walked toward the door, Rachel called after me, her voice breaking. I'm sorry, Em. I really am. I paused, not turning around. I believe you, but I don't forgive you. Not yet. The spring air hit my face as I stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of the Boston Public Garden in bloom. For the first time in weeks, I took a deep breath that didn't hurt my chest. I didn't look back to see Rachel crumbling at our table, didn't need to witness the wreckage she'd created. I walked through the midday crowd, anonymous among the tourists and office workers. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Daniel. I didn't read it. Whatever he had to say could wait. Today wasn't about him or Rachel anymore. It was about me, stepping into whatever came next. I headed toward Boston Common, letting the sun warm my face. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy on my shoulders, but it no longer threatened to crush me. I had faced the worst and remained standing. Everything that followed would be a choice, not a reaction. Weeks later, I stood in line at the passport office on Causeway Street, a crisp new application in hand. The government clerk, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair twisted into a sensible bun, reviewed my documentation with practiced efficiency. "Replacement due to damage?" she asked, glancing at the form where I'd checked that box. "Yes," I replied simply. No need to explain that the damage had been deliberate destruction at the hands of my soon-to-be ex-husband. "This all seems to be in order, Ms. Lawson," she said, stamping the application with finality. "Your new passport should arrive within 3 weeks." 3 weeks. 21 days until I could leave the country if I wanted to. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Walking out of the federal building into the summer sunshine, I felt a curious lightness. I'd reclaimed my passport, this time in pristine condition, and with it, my freedom to move through the world on my own terms. The divorce proceedings had begun with surprising smoothness. After the evidence I'd presented became public, Daniel seemed eager to settle quickly and quietly. His lawyers contacted mine with a generous offer. I would keep my retirement accounts and personal savings, plus a lump sum that made up for my share of our joint assets. In return, I agreed not to pursue further legal action against him or Rachel for identity fraud or defamation. It was a better deal than I'd expected, financially speaking. But money couldn't buy back trust or erase betrayal. Some debts could never be repaid. Rachel had tried to contact me multiple times, calls, texts, even a handwritten letter delivered to my Somerville apartment. I'd ignored them all. Perhaps someday I'd be ready to hear her apologies, but not yet. The wound was still too fresh, the scar tissue too thin. I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop to check flights. After weeks of deliberation, I'd decided on Lisbon. Portugal had been on my travel wish list for years, the colorful buildings cascading down to the sea, the mournful fado music, the historic trolleys climbing steep cobblestone streets. Daniel had always preferred beach resorts in the Caribbean. This would be my trip and mine alone. I booked a one-way ticket for exactly 1 month from today, giving myself plenty of time for the passport to arrive. Then I emailed my new boss at Vertex Marketing, a smaller firm where I'd landed a senior position after the scandal at my previous company had made staying impossible. They'd agreed to a remote work arrangement for 2 months while I sorted out personal matters, a euphemism for rebuilding my life from the ground up. Flight booked for Lisbon, I wrote to Michael, my new supervisor. "I'll be set up and working by the following Monday." His response came quickly. "Breathe the sea air for me. Team is excited for you to start the London project remotely." I smiled, closing my laptop. From the shambles of my former life, new opportunities had emerged. The job at Vertex actually offered more creative control than my previous position. My temporary apartment had become a cozy haven. Even my new hair color had grown on me, the auburn bringing out gold flecks in my eyes I'd never noticed before. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at Alina in Cambridge, a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, but Daniel had dismissed as too experimental. Sitting at the small bar, savoring the warm spices of the Mediterranean, I caught my reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. The woman staring back seemed both familiar and foreign, harder around the eyes, perhaps, but with a confidence I hadn't seen in years. The bartender, a bearded man with kind eyes, noticed me studying myself. "Everything to your liking?" "Perfect," I replied, and meant it. Not just the food, but this moment of independence. This reclamation of my own tastes and preferences. "First time here?" he asked, pouring me another glass of Portuguese wine. "First of many," I said, raising my glass in a small toast to myself. By the time my passport arrived, a slim blue booklet with empty pages waiting for stamps, I had settled my affairs in Boston. I'd visited my mother one last time, explaining in simple terms that I would be traveling for a while but would call often. Her lucid moments were becoming rarer, but she'd squeezed my hand and said, "You always did want to see the world, Emmy." I'd sold or donated most of my furniture, keeping only what would fit in storage or my suitcases. My life had been distilled to essentials, and the lightness of this new minimalism felt right. The morning of my departure brought clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect flying weather. My taxi driver to Logan Airport was talkative, asking about my destination. Lisbon, I told him. For a while. Running away or running toward, he asked with the casual philosophy of those who transport people to life transitions daily. I considered his question as we merged onto the expressway, the Boston skyline receding in the distance. Both, I think. Sometimes you need to leave to find yourself. He nodded sagely in the rearview mirror. Ain't that the truth? Standing at the departure gate, I felt the weight of the past lift from my shoulders like a heavy cloak. I was no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to become. The Emily who had fled her apartment in tears no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. My phone vibrated with a text message. Daniel, I heard you're leaving the country. I'm sorry for everything. I should have trusted you. After a moment's hesitation, I typed a response. Trust, once broken, is like a shattered mirror. You can glue it back together, but you'll always see the cracks in the reflection. I hit send, then immediately blocked his number. No more looking back. As passengers began boarding, I joined the line, passport in hand. The gate agent smiled as she scanned my boarding pass. Enjoy Lisbon. I will, I promised, stepping forward into the jetway. I spent the flight staring out at the clouds, envisioning the life I'd rebuild, a life rooted in truth, resilience, and self-respect. The ache of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled a determination to protect my peace, to create boundaries that honored who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. 7 hours later, the plane descended through wispy clouds toward Lisbon's airport. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the city in warm hues, the red-tiled roofs and pastel buildings sprawling toward the shimmering Atlantic. As the wheels touched down, I felt something unlock inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but release. While other passengers rushed to gather their belongings, I remained seated, taking a moment to acknowledge this threshold I was crossing. I pulled out the wedding photo I'd grabbed that night, the last physical tie to my old life. I studied it one final time, the hopeful smile on my younger face, Daniel's arm around my waist, Rachel standing nearby as maid of honor. I slipped the photo into the seat pocket in front of me. Someone else could discard it, or perhaps keep it as a curiosity, a fragment of a stranger's former life. As the plane emptied, I finally stood, retrieving my carry-on from the overhead bin. Walking through the terminal toward passport control, I whispered a quiet farewell to the old me and a final promise to myself. I would never again allow someone else's lies to dictate my worth. The Portuguese immigration officer stamped my new passport, the blue ink marking the first page of this empty book. Bem-vinda a Lisboa, he said with a smile. Welcome to Lisbon. I stepped through the gate into my future, ready to fill those blank pages with my own truth.